So we are going to wrap up with our final fireside chat. Wonderful, if I can say it this way, bookend to terrific conversations that we've had thus far. So I am going to introduce Dr. Terry Roig, who is a professor here, National Security Affairs Department, and he will be serving as a moderator, and we are genuinely excited to welcome Ambassador Julie Turner as well, and I will turn it over to you, Terry. Please welcome them.
Thank you very much, and it is truly an honor to be able to welcome Ambassador Julie Turner here to the Naval War College for a discussion on a difficult and a sad subject, North Korean human rights. Ambassador Turner is the U.S. Special Envoy for North Korean human rights issues. She is a globally recognized expert in the area of human rights and democracy, and has worked for the past 20 years in the State Department and on the National Security Council to strengthen democratic institutions and to promote human rights in East Asia and the Pacific region. There's a much more detailed biography in your program, but thank you very much for joining us. So let's jump right in because we don't have a lot of time. I will start with a few questions, and this is truly a fireside chat here, so it will be questions only. And let me begin, first of all, by saying that we are all generally aware of the abysmal human rights record that North Korea has. Could you begin by giving us a brief summary of the situation and some examples to give us a sense of what the human rights situation is in North Korea? And in particular, could you describe some of the challenges that North Korean women face and what types of gender-based violence is present under the Kim regime?
First, I'd just like to say thank you for having me here today. I've been really enjoying the conversation, both from the perspective of looking at how women, peace, and security should be integrated into international security and the outward-facing efforts of the various agencies and departments that are represented here. But also the last panel was, especially as a woman leader in the government, really helpful to hear some different perspectives. And I also feel really humbled to be a speaker here with you all today in the presence of so many other really amazing and talented women leaders. To dive into your question on North Korea's situation, the situation of human rights in North Korea, it is one of the most egregious human rights situations in the world. I was just in Geneva a few weeks ago for North Korea's Universal Periodic Review. And when you start going through the laundry list of human rights abuses and violations being committed there, we have to deliver an intervention on the part of the U.S. government to raise our topmost concerns on North Korea's human rights record. And we have to do that in 3 minutes or less. Actually, what it ended up being this last cycle was 90 seconds. It's really hard to boil down extrajudicial killings, arbitrary detention, violations of freedom of expression, violations of freedom of movement, all down into that 90-second bubble. One of the things that I will highlight, though, is recently during the COVID-19 pandemic period, the North Korean government took steps to actually increase repression on its people. And the human rights situation that many of us thought couldn't get worse has unfortunately declined pretty significantly. One of the things that the North Korean government did was they put into place a number of laws that specifically target the flow of foreign information into North Korea. So it's now a punishable crime to use a South Korean dialect in North Korea under the Pyongyang dialect law. There's also a new anti-reactionary thought law, which makes it illegal to watch a K-drama. And in fact, many of these laws are targeting youth in particular, which is also another escalation that we've seen. Not only are the punishments becoming more severe, but things that we previously thought were kind of off limits, even for the North Koreans, are no longer off limits. We've seen middle school students being tried in public trials for watching K-dramas. We have heard reports that children are being publicly executed for listening to K-pop or watching American movies. And so it does seem as though the situation has gotten significantly worse. We also continue to see reports that North Korea is exporting workers to foreign governments or foreign locations, including Russia and China, where they are working in slave labor conditions. Many work 18 hours a day. They don't have access to their passports. They don't have freedom of movement, even in these foreign countries. They're monitored 24 hours a day by a Ministry of State Security official. And all of that money that they're making goes directly into the hands of the regime, which then uses that money to fund its illicit weapons program. Now, how this all relates to women in particular, particularly in the last few years, with the increased level of repression, we've seen this disproportionately impact women who were oftentimes able to start small businesses within the black markets. But during COVID, the regime took steps to shut those markets down. And some of that has increased food insecurity issues, which drives more and more women to cross the border into China in search of food, which then makes them vulnerable to trafficking in persons and other sorts of abuses that we see happening on the Chinese side of the border. Right now, even though refugee numbers as a whole are down significantly since the pre-COVID times, we still see, in fact, the numbers are disproportionately in favor of women. Pre-COVID, there were about 70% of the defector population or the escapee population were women. Now it's almost 90% of the population that find their way to either South Korea or the United States or another country that takes refugees are women.
Thank you. So this year marked the 20th anniversary of George W. Bush signing the North Korea Human Rights Act that shined a light on North Korean human rights abuses and also created the position of Special Envoy that you hold. Over these 20 years, what would you say and highlight are the chief successes that the position has been able to achieve?
So I think one of the most important things that the law itself did was it created a pathway for resettlement for North Korean refugees to the United States, where we have, in particular over the last few years, really expanded our efforts to provide greater supports to that refugee population. In the course of my almost 20 years working on this issue, I've had the opportunity to interview thousands of North Korean escapees. And one of the things that the population often shares is that contact with foreign information was what opened their eyes to the potential and the opportunity that exists in free and open societies. And so through the North Korean Human Rights Act, having more North Korean refugees coming into the United States, or providing more supports through other provisions of the Act, which provide foreign assistance authorizations to support democracy and human rights programs. We've seen a lot of that go into investing in the successes of those refugee populations and having more successful stories of North Koreans who become entrepreneurs in the US, or we've had a number of North Korean refugees serve as national assemblymen in South Korea. We have actually North Korean escapees serving in the US military now. Watching them or being able to show those images of North Koreans flourishing, prospering, achieving dreams that were unimaginable in a North Korean context have been a key messaging point for us to push back into North Korea through many of our access to information efforts to help try to grow a broader understanding within North Korea to foster or at least plant the seeds for a future civil society there.
If I could join in on or add on to your comments about the women who, the large percentage of women who make up those who are the escapees from North Korea. I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about why that percentage is so high, and that women, as they cross typically into China, which is the usual route, are really a very vulnerable population to trafficking. If they are caught, they are sent back to North Korea for very dire circumstances. I wonder if you could talk a bit more about what challenges North Korean women as escapees face in that journey and beyond.
So I think one of the drivers, I mean, a number of things could be contributing factors into why the number is so disproportionately in favor of women. The first one is an earlier wave of North Korean escapees were primarily men. This was decades ago, and once those men were able to get to South Korea or elsewhere in the world, they saved money. They used the stipend that they were receiving from the South Korean government to pay brokers to eventually bring family members along in that process, and so wives and children came later. Another component, though, is the freedom that began to exist in maybe a decade ago when the black markets really took off. And I say freedom, not government-granted freedom, but really a people-driven freedom in that these people were looking for ways to survive. They created these small businesses in the black markets, and a lot of the women were the ones that didn't have a government-assigned job to go to every day, and that gave them the freedom and flexibility to start these other initiatives, these side hustles, if you will. That led to many of them starting to cross the border into China, and as the food security situation kind of ebbed and flowed over the years, some of them chose to stay on the Chinese side of the border. Some of them also became trafficking victims and were sold into forced marriages with Chinese men, and because they sometimes initiated or started families with those Chinese men, they stayed a little bit longer than they probably had ever intended to stay in China. What we're seeing now is many of those women feeling increasingly insecure because they don't have formal status in China, and they are now starting to migrate towards either South Korea or elsewhere in the world where they may have more freedom and flexibility. The situation that they experience in China is equally tenuous. I don't know, some of you may have heard over the past year of a film called Beyond Utopia, but it does a great job of highlighting the really difficult journey that North Korean refugees take. Getting out of North Korea is really only half of the battle for these individuals. Not only do you pay thousands of dollars to get out of North Korea, but then you pay, sometimes right now the estimates are about $10,000 to $20,000 US to get from the Northeast in China to Southeast Asia, where you might be able to access the South Korean government or the US government to find permanent resettlement options. But that journey can be very difficult, not only physically, because you're traipsing through jungles in Southeast Asia, but also from the pure just emotional and mental trauma that comes with feeling like you must constantly be on high alert.
To shift gears a bit, a few years ago, Robert King, who held the position of Special Envoy for 8 years, helped to publish a book called The North Korean Conundrum: Balancing Human Rights and Nuclear Security. Certainly when we think of North Korea these days as a security challenge, our attention typically goes towards nuclear weapons and ballistic missiles, yet the human rights problem remains. As indicated in Ambassador King's book title, what would be your argument for why human rights needs to still be on the table and as an important element of our concerns about North Korea? And how do you think the United States has done over the years in maintaining that balance?
So I would argue, and this is a talking point that the U.S. has been using at the United Nations recently, is that the human rights situation in North Korea is inextricably linked to international peace and security. And in saying that, there is the very kind of practical thing that many of us see in our day-to-day work, which is North Korea is exporting these workers are generating revenue, that revenue goes back and funds the weapons program, which then poses a threat to all of us, which is a real thing. The second area that I think probably comes up quite frequently is the risk of migration issues that result from North Korea's repression, and that we do have this refugee flow program that does then bleed into China, impacts our partners in Southeast Asia as well, and the dynamics that come with refugee flows and displaced persons. But then there's the more practical one that's a little bit more difficult of a story to tell, but I think is really at the core of all of this, which is that the repression and the abuses that exist in North Korea create an environment where the government isn't accountable to anyone. There's no transparency, there's no accountability. Kim Jong-un could wake up in a bad mood one day and decide that he wants to launch a nuclear weapon at Hawaii, or wants to do another nuclear test and just gauge who's going to side with him on whatever topic. Or he could deploy troops to Russia, as we just saw him do recently this year. Part of the reason why addressing the human rights situation is so critical to this is because by pushing information into the North Korean people, by highlighting and creating space for them to practice and exercise their universally protected rights, is that it creates an informed citizenry who can apply domestic internal pressure on the government to be responsive, to be accountable. If the government actually put its resources towards feeding its population instead of its weapons program, then the food security issues wouldn't be the problem that they are today. And so thinking about these as these efforts to promote human rights in North Korea as a part of our broader national security interests, as a broader international security problem, is really kind of at the core of how we address this problem.
Let me ask one last question, and then we will open it up to the floor. So start those wheels turning and have your questions ready. Let me just conclude my questions with your assessment of where you see the future going in regards to North Korean human rights issues, and where you see possibilities for progress in the next 5 to 10 years or so.
So I think, one, we're at a critical moment right now, particularly in efforts to promote the free flow of independent information into North Korea. Earlier this year, Kim Jong-un tossed out the window the very core belief in North Korea that reunification was the end goal. that created, and we've seen this through a lot of interviews with recent escapees or defectors, that cognitive dissonance for so many North Koreans, that this thing that I believed for my entire life to be true, now the government is telling me was all a lie and is made up. They also see really concretely that this new concept that the government is pushing, that North Koreans are different people than South Koreans, can't logically be true, because you literally have still living people who were separated families during the war, right? People who may have a brother who is living in the South. So we're not different people, we're literally from the same mother in some of these instances. And so all of this cognitive dissonance that's been created, all of these pieces of propaganda that they're pushing out right now are really actually starting to cause people to question what information the regime or the government is feeding them, which gives us an opportunity to push credible information in that helps create a more educated and informed citizenry. I think in terms of engagement with North Korea and practical progress on a lot of these issues, which is inevitably the end goal, right? Because we're not going to have progress, we're not going to see concrete change on North Korean human rights or on the security issue unless we get back to the table at some point in time. And so how do we move in that direction? On the US side, we've made it very clear to the North Korean government that we're ready to sit down and to talk about any issue the North Koreans want to talk about without preconditions. I've regularly said, even in the human rights space, we're ready and prepared to talk about it. We talk about human rights with our partners and allies, but we also talk about it with other governments that we have new and growing relationships with. And we can do that while also talking about security partnerships. That is the hardest part of my job, though. Under the North Korean Human Rights Act, part of my mandate includes dialoguing with the North Korean government on human rights. When they have spent more time calling me names, speaking of gender, I have been called wicked woman. The apostle of aggression is my favorite, but many times, which you can all tell how apostle-like I am. They've commented on the clothes that I wear, which is also ironic because they've commented on my swooshing skirts, which for anyone that's known me for even a half a second, I own like one skirt. And so I did make it a point to go out and purchase my second skirt after they made that comment so that I could wear it just for them in public engagements. But all that aside, we do genuinely want to get back to the table and talk to them, and we do want to talk about human rights. And so some of the areas of potential opportunity could be in a space where they have already shown a willingness to work, or at least have initiated a conversation themselves. And those areas really have been in three areas where there are international treaty bodies that govern those. One is women's issues in particular. They are a party to the Convention on the Elimination of Discrimination Against Women, CEDAW. They are also a party to the Convention on the Rights of the Child. And then also, they just recently, in 2017, ratified the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities. And so these are all areas that potentially create opportunities for conversation, and ones where, based on our own experiences, we may have the ability to have a more frank and candid conversation that's a two-way conversation. And so we have also been making it clear to them that those are areas where we're not seeking to just finger wag, but also really want to, are willing to be upfront about our own journey in wrestling with these things domestically as well.
Thank you very much. This was very enlightening, and apostle of aggression. I have to write that one down for the future. Well, thank you very much. That was awesome. Please join me in